Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to those that have helped organize this event in a place where we can remember and mourn and honor those who stepped heroically in to save others, and we can mourn the many, many, not just that were killed on 9/11, but those in the years after that have been so devastated by the effects of their heroism. I appreciate the testimony of each of the secretaries and your willingness to be with us today. You acknowledged in our discussions last night that that in some respects we play the role of a board or a policy group, and as a committee we have the opportunity to help guide the leadership at the Department of Homeland Security. The area of cyber and cyber threats has been mentioned by each one of you as being a major area of concern, and I'd like just to dwell for a moment on that. Secretary Napolitano, you indicated that perhaps more funding to Department of Energy laboratories to help develop new technologies there would be helpful. You also referenced public-private partnerships, and there's no question but that the private sector is racing to try and find technologies that they can sell, make money on to protect various entities from cyber attack. Secretary Johnson, you indicated in your written testimony that that deterring actors from attacking us, cyber actors, is also something we should pursue. And perhaps we'll begin with you then, Secretary Johnson, and have each of you respond to what we might do to up our capabilities in deterring cyber attacks. Specifically, I'm thinking with regards to your testimony, how can we deter those entities that attack us? China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, they continue to launch hundreds, thousands of attacks on technical databases, government databases, corporations, and so forth. Is there some way we can do a better job of deterring that? And then for all of you, how do we up our game in cyber beyond where we are today?
I think it's a basic equation. In my experience, all nation states, all organized nation states, whether they're democracies or monarchies or communist regimes, are deterred if the behavior is made cost prohibitive, if the nation state recognizes that it's just not worth the cost in terms of the reaction of the target. And we all know that between and among governments, there's a certain amount of surveillance activity that goes on. But we're, as I'm sure you recognize, at a new level of the theft of intellectual property, weaponizing things for political purposes that are hacked, that are stolen. And I believe that you cannot create a complete line of defense against these kinds of attacks, and therefore we have to put it to the bad actor and simply make the behavior cost prohibitive. I think that a lot of good things have been done in this administration in terms of sanctions directed at Russians, the Russian government, and by the Congress. But if you believe the intelligence assessments, a lot more is necessary, both directed against Russia and the other countries that you mentioned. Now, in terms of what more we can do on the defensive side, on my watch, we really enhanced the capability of the NKIC, which is within DHS. It's the information hub for cybersecurity. But I was disappointed when I was leaving office that not more private sector actors had partnered with DHS for information sharing purposes. And so I'd recommend to Congress that you check in on that occasionally and you see what you can do to more encourage that type of information sharing.
Yes, I think the NKIC is a valuable resource at the department for bringing together the public and private aspects of cybersecurity. You know, cyber is an inordinately complicated topic. It's international in scope. The technology changes faster than we can change laws or policy. It requires an agility and nimbleness that is really not the hallmark of government. That is one of the reasons why it's so important to bring the private sector into how we deal with cybersecurity as a country. We need a whole of government, a whole of nation approach to this area. We need to recognize that it is among the top 3 risks that we face as a nation. When you read the 9/11 Commission report, one of the key critiques it makes is that there were all these they were reverse engineering how the 9/11 attack occurred. And the report points out all these red flags that had arisen, and they said that a key critique is that our government leaders suffered from a failure of imagination. In the cyber arena, we have all these red flags now. We should not entertain such a failure of imagination. And perhaps it is time for the country to have a 9/11 commission for cyber before we have, for example, massive ransomware attacks simultaneously conducted around the country, or where we suffer once again a direct attack on our democracy as we saw in the 2016 election.
So let me just add this. The challenge here is that much of the infrastructure is in private hands. And even when it's in government hands, it's often distributed in local governments, and sometimes even the basics don't get done. And that's a challenge because you're really trying to herd the cats in a particular direction. I'd say there are three things, though, that I might pay some additional attention to. One is I do think that the department has made a good step forward in standing up CISA from what used to be the NPPD and becoming more operationally involved in working with the private sector on upping their game. One of the things that would help would be to give private sector actors more access to classified information. Right now, it's very hard to pass the suitability test, which is a requirement that you have a need to know classified information. It's nothing to do with whether you're a reliable person. It's just whether you have a need to know. If you're a contractor, that's an easy thing to satisfy. But if you're running critical infrastructure, it gets difficult. And I think changing the mindset on that and opening up the aperture for information would be very helpful. Second, I do agree we need sometimes, particularly with nation states, to be able to impose a cost. But we have to be candid. The structure in terms of how we escalate is still very undefined. And what we don't want to do is accidentally trigger a war because we overreact to something. So I think there needs to be some serious thought and perhaps some hearings on the question of what is the appropriate scale of escalation in response to certain attacks. And finally, I think we need to look at our what I would call industrial policy as it relates to very sensitive technology. And Mike McConnell, the former DNI, and I did a piece on this a few weeks ago. We don't have a policy to encourage U.S. or allied businesses to invest in critical technologies that we need to control in order to make sure the Chinese don't own us and eat our lunch. And you're seeing this play out with 5G right now, where Huawei, with Chinese government subsidies, is pushing out to have the equipment that forms the backbone of 5G around the world. We go to our allies, we say, don't do this. And I've done this myself, and a lot of times what we hear back is, well, the problem is you can't beat something with nothing. What do you have that's better and cheaper? And part of the problem is we haven't facilitated a market in that kind of technology. We do it in the defense business with a defense industrial base. I would argue we need to now have a policy like that with what I would call the tech national security base. And that, I think, would be well worth looking at.